that, let me welcome all to this roundtable on the trade policy India needs. Uh, this is a national issue, but we still have a lot of our friends from abroad, particularly two from Bangladesh, Zaidi Sattar and Razak. Razak, having worked with the Commonwealth Secretariat for a long time, is very familiar with the Indian trade policy. And we also are very privileged to have Martin Wolf, an India watcher from Washington, where he's attending the bank fund meetings, other than Arne Melchior, a friend from Norway, and uh, sorry, Andres Sapir from Brussels. Having said that, and we also are joined now by Harshvardhan Singh and Veena Jha from Delhi. Having said that, let me begin with the genesis of today's roundtable. It lies in a thought-provoking article written by Montek in late July, on which Cuts ran a debate on our e-forums, where most of you participated. We received diverse comments and opinions from a range of experts, sparking off a conversation on this important topic. This evening's roundtable will mark the culmination of this rich debate, resulting in some concrete outcomes which we hope we can share with the Government of India. Today, we hope to move from conversation to action and come up with concrete recommendations which we can relate to our policymakers. We want to design a practical roadmap for the Government of India to achieve the trade policy India needs. The summary document distilling the debate has identified a few major action points which this roundtable will take forward. The summary document was sent out to all the speakers who are here, and I hope you've been able to go through it at least to some extent, if not fully. Key among them is the need to design trade policy which is coherent with industrial policy, competition policy, investment policy, as well as knowledge and innovation policy. It also needs to be future-proofed, including by supporting green manufacturing to preserve our export interests in rapidly decarbonizing export markets. Following today's deliberations, the strategy paper to develop these details will be prepared in order to identify and address existing gaps. This is an opportune moment to clearly evaluate India's trade policy goals and the actions required to achieve them. The new foreign trade policy, which has been in the making for a long time, has been deferred till the next financial year. So that is a window of opportunity for us. The Government of India has recently embarked on an overhaul of the highest offices of the India's trade policy administration as well. A new national logistics policy has been notified late last month, which seeks to provide a pathway for the development of the entire logistics ecosystem and thus improving our competitiveness. All these steps need to be part of a larger strategic plan to increase trade and not just exports, which has to be driven by a whole of society approach. The objective of today's roundtable is therefore to devise the strategic plan focusing on pointed recommendations. Some of these recommendations which have come forward in the discussion that we've had, which includes the issue about disadvantaged groups, has there been a specific reference to that, and gender. And the third was SMEs. All these require very special and distinct treatment from a generic. I remain an eternal optimist, but have also seen over the decades that despite our best efforts, there remains a gulf between the trade policy India needs and the trade policy India gets. We must relentlessly and resolutely advocate for the best ways to bridge this gulf. That is my call to this eminent group today, and I'm again very, very thankful to each one of you for having agreed to participate in this roundtable without necessarily being a panelist as such. Let me welcome and thank Martin, Naushad, Montek, and all others present, and to Suresh Bhai when he comes later, for taking us time and joining us today. I look forward to a productive discussion. Let me now begin with Naushad, which is opening remarks. The idea is that after Naushad speaks, we'll have Martin, and followed by an open house that we would go to each speaker to the extent possible. Anwar Hoda has sent a short note as well, which has also been circulated It's probably in your inbox. Let me invite Naushad to please 7 to 8 minutes, Naushad. Will
Sure,
that be enough?
more than thanks.
Thank you.
so, so good evening, and I think for some of you, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Pradeep, for convening this session. You know, I think the reason I was asked to speak first is because I'm by far the least trade expert among this entire group. So I better get my statements in quickly. So I'll make very quickly 3 points. I think none of this will be new, but I think it's always useful to remind ourselves of these 3 points. The first is that India's history, recent economic history, it seems to me makes a very powerful case for free trade. If you look at where we were in 1991 as a country, we were pretty isolated. We were inward looking. And if you look at trade as a percentage of GDP, we were well behind. We were even behind the US in 1991 as for trade as a percentage of GDP. We were well behind China. If you look at how things have evolved in these last 30 years, trade as a percentage of GDP rose from what it was, which I think was around 15% in 1991, to a high of 55% in the early 2010s, I think in 2012, and has since fallen back to around 40%. But at 40%, it's still significantly higher than trade as a percentage of GDP for the United States, or indeed even trade as a percentage of GDP for China today. Not much higher, but somewhat higher. So this was what trade did for India. Trade grew. India's export and import grew by a factor of 10 in that 30-year period. And that performance went with our most rapid economic growth in our history over long periods of time, with trade playing a significant role in the rapid growth rate that we experienced. That's the first point. The second point is, what should we be doing going forward? And that comes to Pradeep's question, where he says that, what should our agenda be? And it seems to me that our agenda should be, if you like, twofold. And this twofold agenda should be supplemented by a particular activity that we need to undertake in Indian industry. The twofold agenda is that we need to, it seems to me, be much more aggressive with free trade agreements. By dropping out of RCEP in 2019, we missed an opportunity to integrate with the most dynamic part of the world economy. And as I'll come to in a minute, we largely dropped out of RCEP because of concerns from industry. And concerns from industry that I think are actually not well founded and not based on our actual experience. So the first thing that we need to do is to indeed be much more aggressive in negotiating and signing free trade agreements with different countries. And it's encouraging that in the last year and a half or so, we've returned to the free trade agreement negotiating table. We've, as you know, signed an agreement with the UAE. We've signed an agreement, a limited agreement with Australia, which is meant to be deepened as we go ahead. We're either in the final stages of signing a free trade agreement with the UK, or it's no longer going to happen because of certain political comments that were made recently that have nothing to do with trade. And we're negotiating currently a free trade agreement with Canada and the free trade agreement with the EU, which we were negotiating, I think, for a period of 13 or 14 years, and then went into cold storage for 4 or 5 years, is now again has been taken up for negotiation. And if it happens, will be clearly the big free trade agreement for us. What's not on the cards as of now is the United States. And the reason the US is important to us is that the US is our largest trading partner, but even more, it's the country with whom we have the largest trade surplus of any country. And it seems to me that it's eminently sound to try to lock in access to our largest trading partner and access to exporting to our largest trading partner through a free trade agreement. Now, it's not on the cards, not because of a lack of interest only from India. There's also very little interest by the current US administration in signing any free trade agreements apparently with anyone. But I think we should be pursuing whatever opportunities we have to move the trade agenda forward with the US. So, for example, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is an obvious opportunity for us to participate much more aggressively on trade. We've so far kept out of the trade pillar. It's something we should start engaging with in a very tangible, direct way, and the sooner we do it, the better. The second thing that we need to do is to learn from our experience of our past free trade agreements. If you look at the data, what the data shows is that the free trade agreements that we signed with ASEAN, with Sri Lanka, with Korea, with Japan, that the free trade agreements that we signed did not actually move the proportion of India's trade in the direction of the free trade agreement countries. It seems to me that should be the metric of success of a free trade agreement. That does the proportion of trade, imports and exports that happen between two countries that have signed a free trade agreement move in that direction. Neither imports nor exports changed significantly as a proportion of our total imports or our total exports with the free trade agreements. So they weren't a disaster for India or Indian industry, but they also had relatively little effect. And when people have looked at these free trade agreements, the argument is, well, okay, so why did they have relatively little effect? They had relatively little effect, people argue, because maybe they didn't go far enough. They didn't cover enough items, and they did not go for zero tariffs in many, many cases, or had actually left out many, many items of interest. And in particular, they did not go far enough to allow India to become a significant participant in the value chains that were springing up all around Asia. So we had a free trade agreement with with ASEAN overall, and with specific separate agreements, as you know, with Singapore and Thailand. But in spite of that, those trade agreements did not actually enable us to participate in the various value chains that were thriving in this same period of time, in the 2000s and 2010s, across those very same countries in Asia. And I think we should learn from that experience to not only sign free trade agreements with countries of interest, but sign free trade agreements that are wider and deeper than what we've so far had the courage to do. So those are the two things that I think we should do. Lock in countries of interest. So the United States particularly, the EU as fast as we can get things to move along. These are big markets for us. The UK will without doubt be useful. But we should also be looking at how we can engage with the emerging African free trade area, which is an obvious market of interest for us. We should be looking at what we can do in Latin America, again, of interest to us. And at some point in time, I hope we can shed our inhibitions of doing anything that's anywhere near China to engage more actively in Asia, at least in Asia beyond China. And an opportunity to do that is obviously IPEF, which would not only bring in the US, but bring in many of these other markets in Asia too. A last point is on the big change that we need to bring about in Indian industry. You know, when RCEP happened, when we dropped out of RCEP, the general perception was that Indian industry was against RCEP. And certainly if you read our papers, that's what you would take away from the headlines and the coverage of comments that prominent industrialists had made. In CI, I was involved in an exercise to bring a lot of different industry groups together, where we tried to get industry to articulate its offensive interests in RCEP. Meaning we had lots of arguments why we wanted to defend the Indian market in terms of access, but we had very little in the way of concrete asks from the RCEP negotiations of what we wanted access to in the RCEP markets. When we finally dropped out of the process, we did a poll within a pretty prominent group of leading companies in CI. And I think that poll was quite representative of Indian industry. And the poll showed that 57% thought it was a bad idea for India to have dropped out of RCEP. 27% thought the government was right to drop out of RCEP. That's not what you would conclude from reading the coverage of the time. And what I took away from that gap between what the poll said and what we read in the press, in the popular press, was that Indian industry does a pretty poor job of articulating its actual interest in free trade. The Indian industry, that the voices that one hears are generally the voices that are more inward-looking and protectionist. The voices that you should be hearing, the people who are really interested in engaging in the world, in investing in the world, in accessing foreign markets, and doing much more with free trade, are relatively silent. So I think one of our tasks should be to very consciously and explicitly articulate the interests of Indian industry, sector by sector, in free trade agreements, what our offensive interests particularly are in terms of access to these markets, and then to actually encourage that voice to be heard, not just in the government, but heard more broadly in the country. So I will stop there. As I said, thank you again, Pradeep, for convening this.
Thank you, Naushad. Thank you very much. We will be. This is online, and we should be releasing it as well. As what we are doing is for the information of all that this is an invitees only event. It's not a public event, but we are going to tweet very specific, succinct remarks, and I hope none of you would mind that. With that, let me also welcome Naushad. There are two more gentlemen I would like to recognize. Is Mark Linscott, former US ASTR, who would be speaking down the line, and Thorav Stenfold from the Norwegian Foreign Ministry. So we have two more guests who are very interested in India. With that, let me now to Sunita. Sunita Raj, a professor at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, has been making very valuable contributions. And may I request Sunita if she could speak for about 3 to 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes? I believe Suresh Prabhu has also joined.
Is it possible?
1 minute, I beg your pardon.
I have come out of a public event.
Yeah.
No. Don't mind if.
No, 1 minute. Yeah, okay. Suresh bhai, please go ahead.
Please, thank you. So,
Sunita, I'll come back to you later. I forgot.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
So I am first apologies to all others who may be wanting to speak now, but I have just come out of a public event where to go and again speak. That's why I've taken this opportunity. Thank you very much. And thank you, Pradeep bhai, for organizing the event.
May I request you to give us some very, your own experience as a commerce minister. What do you think are
I'll tell you. I'll only tell you that. Only 2 minutes. I'll just do 3 minutes only. Or maybe 7 minutes. See, one is we had set up a group chaired by Surjit Bhalla, maybe 5 years ago. In which we had top people, including the present foreign minister. That time he was with the Tatas. He was a member. CI was a member, many others. The whole idea of that group, the task force, was how do you increase India's share in global trade? Now, the trade is extremely important for domestic economies to grow. And trade is always has certain downsides and upsides. It's up to us to prepare domestic strategy to ensure that the downsides are minimized and the upsides are properly leveraged to make sure that our economies grow fast. In fact, that findings of that, and I spent lot of time with that group. And recently, when Sujit Balla, when he was at the IMF, met me in Washington, D.C., he was saying many of those ideas are now getting implemented because we actually had laid down a complete strategy and a roadmap. So the point is, we need trade as a launching pad for growth of the economy. There's no question about it. And when you say trade, it cannot just be exports, because I maintained it and I will repeat again that you cannot just export because the rest of the world is not going to just import. And if the rest of the world is only importing, then there is only export for us and for no other country there's an export. So therefore, there are always the trade-offs and we have to accept the reality that they will work. Now, particularly now, when we prepared it, there was no sign of COVID. There was no sign of today's geopolitical tension that are developed in the world. But still we had prepared it because we thought we should think cool-headedly about the state strategies for India. That report is there and we can actually use it very effectively. Secondly, even for the special economic areas from where we can actually have exports coming in a big way, we actually appointed Baba Kalyani, who is the chairman of Bharat Forge, and appointed him in a very small group to prepare a strategy for it. That is also there for the last 4-5 years. Both the things that I told you, 5-6 years ago, they're already, roadmaps are ready. What we really need to do. I agree with just now when Naushad was speaking. I think it's absolutely right that there may be some voices which are aired, not necessarily understanding the whole ambit of it. So therefore, when we were the largest economy of the world, did we become the largest economy without exports? Did we at that particular time, if we had not any footprint globally, and our people had not gone abroad, could we have become the largest economy? So the trade was also the reason why we became the largest economy. And now when we have the aspiration to begin with 5, 10, 20, 30, whatever numbers, and that will happen in any case because the natural growth will happen. But how soon is an important issue. 5 trillion, I had prepared a roadmap and can happen within the next few years. But if you want to become 10, 15 trillion, the timeline is important. The timeline can be reduced if we are integrated into global trade more. And now at a time when we are seeing that even the domestic trade has relationship with global trade. There is no point to expand on this point, but I will just tell you briefly, Pradeep bhai, I feel that we really need to relook at India's trade policy as a launching pad for growth of India's economy. If you feel that we want to reduce the poverty in India, the global trade can actually help us to do that in a big way. If we want technology infusion in India, the global trade can actually make that happen in a big way. If you want domestic investment to be supplemented by FDI, only the trade can actually make that happen in a big way. So there are many upsides available as a trade, as a drawing force.
Sir,
and as what you wanted to ask me,
Suresh,
the report is already there.
May I ask you a question? Having been Commerce Minister and having seen it firsthand, what do you think are the drawbacks that need to be addressed?
See,
or the pitfalls?
See, basically, whether you like it or not, you mean jobs, right?
Drawbacks. I mean, what are the sort of negative factors that need to be overcome?
Sorry?
What are the negative factors which need to be overcome in order to be able to do what you're suggesting? No, I mean, you've spoken about 2 good reports, but one doesn't know what is happening.
That's why I'm saying we must make people understand this. I will tell you, I will give only one example and I will end it. When I was the Minister of Environment and Forest 23 years ago, I used to tell people that if you want to understand, protect wildlife, you must make people understand that human life is dependent on wildlife. Then only wildlife will be protected. If you want to protect trade to be grown, you must make people understand that domestic economy cannot grow unless the trade grows. I think that's one of the most important thing, and we must create that kind of awareness. That's the only way we can make it happen. Thank you.
That's a very good point. Can I just ask you to stay for a few minutes while Martin Wolf is going to speak? And we are actually very grateful for Martin having agreed to speak, though he's got other commitments in Washington at the moment. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I can't participate in much of the meeting. Somebody mute.
Can everybody mute, please? Suresh bhai, can you mute yourself? Yeah, thank you.
So I followed the issue of Indian trade since the 70s. My first book was about it, and the progress that has been described is very real. I want to make just the following, probably partly provocative points, and then I'm going to run away because I've got to go to a meeting at the IMF. The first point is, in my view, all the experience and India's own experience confirms the very famous description of trade by Irving Kravis, as the handmaiden of development. It's, at the very least, it's the handmaiden of development. The second point I wanted to make is that it's obvious, if you look at it, that the world trading environment is changing in rather big ways, and to some degree unpredictable ways. But I'm convinced it does not mean the end of trade, and not even a collapse of it. Far from it. A renewed bout of export pessimism of the kind that I experienced in India in the 70s is unwarranted. But there will be a degree of decoupling, particularly of the US from China. That's a very powerful trend, I believe. And there will also be exceptionally rapid growth of internet-enabled service trade. And this is very important to remember. India must, because of its resource endowment and abilities and skills, for India's services trade is an immensely important part of the future. The third point I wanted to make is these changes actually create huge opportunities for India. It can, in particular, given the breakdown in relations between China and the US, it has another opportunity already mentioned by Naushad to insert itself into global supply chains with all the benefits that can bring, not just in terms of the volume of exports, but even more important, in my view, in terms of skill acquisition and acceleration of skill acquisition. And this should be, in my view, a central part of a plan for growth acceleration. But it can also increase its strengths in services trade and should think clearly about those opportunities. It's not just about goods, as I've already mentioned. Fourth point, to do this, India needs to up its game substantially in terms of creating the smoothest and easiest possible two-way access, both in terms of formal trade barriers, in terms of physical barriers, and in terms of bureaucratic barriers. This is an extremely high priority if India is to attract the sort of investment, complementary investment from abroad that will be needed to make this supply chain integration really work. I would personally not overdo the hopes for free trade areas. I'd like to point out the US-China trade exploded without any free trade area between them. Just WTO membership. The idea that I'm not opposed to free trade agreements, but they are at the most a handmaiden to the handmaiden. And I think in terms of the effective barriers to increasing trade between India and the rest of the world, I expect the free trade agreements will not make a vital difference, except possibly psychologically. Final point, industrial policy aimed, and this was a big part of the discussion, aimed at creating Indian global champions in sectors where India does not now have significant competitive advantage, is, I believe, a luxury India cannot afford. At least it cannot afford to spend vast resources on this. it's very clear that the ability to exploit trade in the modern era doesn't require the creation of freestanding, independent, autonomous companies which are global leaders in very complicated sectors. If you have them, that's lovely. But my view is if you integrate fully into global knowledge pools, create the skills at home that understands how these sectors work in the process, you can build out from that. Don't make industrial policy the focus of trade policy. Make industrial success the consequence of a successful trade policy. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. That was indeed excellent comments by you, and particularly the thrust which both you and Naushad make on flanking issues, flanking policies. So it's not just trade policy in isolation that will have to be looked at, but flanking as well. With that, may I request Sunita Raju for 3 to 5 minutes, please?
Yeah.
We have very large number of speakers, as I said.
Yeah, I'll take.
Yes, we have
less
about
than
1
that.
hour. And in any event, if any of you would like to raise a point, you're welcome to put up your hand or send me a chat. Use the chat box.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, because the detailed note where actually my thoughts about the nexus between the manufacturing competitiveness or the productivity and the engagement in trade, I've already posted it on that. So I wouldn't repeat those ideas. All that we would say is that, from that note, that increasing the manufacturing output or the productivity or the competition is essential for higher trade engagement for India, particularly because when we see our exports and imports, large part of it, I think about 80% of this is for the manufacturers. So that's how it, it gains its importance. Just to go back on the, the previous FTPs, the trade policies, a quick review of that would show that it's more like a, what we say, a reward kind of a thing. If you do well, you're going to get stars, 1, 2, 3, 4, or you'll get some schemes where you'll be supported. But there is no kind of a linkage between the growth objectives of particular sectors and the expansion of the trade. Probably it was there, but then, it didn't show up in the schemes. And now if you were to see the new trade policies, the focus in the last few months has been to, to draw upon the schemes which are WTO compliant, largely because the earlier schemes like MEIS, SEIS, EOU, SEZ, EPCG are all, are actually not WTO compliant. So our focus has been to, to draw out a new kind of a framework in that aspect. But then I see that, if you were to compare the global challenges, number one, if you see the goal number 9, SDG, is primarily in terms of upgrading the manufacturing sector, integrating it, and also making it more, what we say, appropriate to the requirements of the climate change. And particularly, there is, the targets, if you were to see, the detailed targets under that goal, you will see the SMEs are an integral part of it. So unless and until we integrate the SMEs into the manufacturing, the kind of success.
Sunita, this is a matter of sort of
Yeah.
strategy and implementation. On the
Yeah.
policy itself, you had
Yeah,
some very good
the
comments.
policies, what I would be focused, what I would like to emphasize is that technologies, like for instance, the blockchain has been used by some countries to integrate the SMEs as well as to address the compliance cost of the NTBs. They are expanding in the global.
So technology is very important insofar as the trade policy is concerned. Right. Thank you.
And the other thing is that apart from the FTAs, there have been agreements called the DEPA, which is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which was signed between Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand in 2020. Now, these are the kind of the developments that are happening, and unless and until we are a part of it, I'm not too sure if you will be able to to garner the kind of the growth we require to move up. One
Thank
small
you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Would you like to conclude? Yeah. Can I request Anwarul Hoda? Anwar, are you there? Hoda sir? He was there. I don't know what happened.
He's muted. Hoda sahab, you are muted.
Hoda sahab? Harsh, why don't you take the mic?
Okay, thank you very much. I have some comments on Martin Wolf because he made some very important points, and very quickly I'll summarize some of the key principles which need to be followed for policy. He made 2 points: that the FTA is a handmaiden to the handmaid, and second, that focus on trade policy and not industrial policy. If you look at the coverage of trade policy over time, a lot of those policies are actually classic part of industrial policy, including policies which result in improvement of investment, improving opportunities, reducing time and costs of operations, etc. So I think this distinction between trade policy and industrial policy is a false one. We must strategize, we must learn from those who have succeeded. And empirical evidence also shows that more than merely trade, investment drives both trade and growth. So there is intense competition for investment, and industrial policy is a tool to attract investment and make it successfully operate in the country. So the second is about FTAs. I agree with Naushad, because FTAs are not just a means of getting greater market access. It's also a means of improving your effective competitiveness at a point of time. If you take a look at the top 10 importers in the world, and you just put India and the competing economies with India, I prepared a table on this, and India is number 10 in the table which I prepared. India has FTAs only with 2 of the top 10 importers in the world. All the competing economies had a range of 4 to 7 such agreements. If you just take Vietnam, which has a GDP of about 12% of India, in each of these markets, or in 7 of these markets, Vietnam's share was larger than that of India as far as imports of that country is concerned. It's because of the conditions created for investment and the tariff agreements, etc. So to create a level playing field, if you just have improved the operational conditions, you are reducing your your cost of operation. If you reduce the time of processes, you are improving your competitiveness. But the others are also doing the same. So you will have a greater advantage or lower disadvantage, but the kind of advantages which others who are competing with you have through FTAs, it will be made up only by FTAs. So these are the two comments of mine on Martin Gould's comments. As far as policy is concerned, and you had pointed out also that India has made a lot of progress in terms of having a free trade agreement with India. So we are progressing on that, but we also need to not only implement good policy, we need to implement good practices. And there are good regulatory practices where you have to be transparent, you have to consult, you have to get feedbacks, and you have to make sure that arbitrary policies are not followed. So you have to make sure that not only is the initial framework of policy one which improves situations, but interventions in policy, the way that policy is implemented is very, very important. And once you do that, the confidence of large players who can come here, who can be the lead firms. There are a number of firms which can be lead firms which are Indian, but we also need large global firms to locate here. Many of them are here, but in order to envision scale, because without scale, the focus will remain on the domestic market. And with scale, and you can have it only with competitiveness, then the Indian export drive can also increase. So focus on scale, focus on predictability, avoiding arbitrariness, and when you actually are implementing industrial policy as a trade policy, have your strategic objectives clear and get feedbacks and make those corrections in that. There can be tangible steps which can become examples of these principles, but these are the kind of things I think we need to emphasize.
Thank you, Harsh. Thank you very much. Now we have Anwarul Hoda, followed by Ashwini Mahajan.
Yes, thank you, Pradeep.
Then Razak and Toral, followed by Nagesh and Montek.
Thank you, Pradeep. I think there has been a general agreement in the debates that we have had that there is an urgent need for lowering of tariffs on industrial products in India. Let me just give the direction that I think should be taken for this. To start with, the reduction should take us back to the average level that prevailed 7 to 8 years back. And then we should reduce further to levels prevailing in countries with which we have FTA agreements: Japan, Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, UAE, and China, with which we do not yet have. We will need to undertake roughly a halving of our simple average tariffs on industrial products. Together with this, we need to undertake two types of corrections in our tariff structure. First, the inverted duty structure in some groups of products has to be eliminated. And second, the high effective rates of protection in other groups of products have to be severely moderated. They have stimulated investment flows that are market-seeking rather than efficiency-seeking, and they constrain rather than promote international production sharing arrangements. In many of the exchanges that we have had in the cuts on this subject, a number of colleagues have spoken about the need to have supportive industrial policy, and just now also Harsh also spoke about that. I'll come back to this later, but I would recommend supportive action in areas that determine our competitiveness in industry. and the attractiveness of the country for industrial investment, including foreign direct investment. In a world that remains highly globalized, the logistics infrastructure, particularly the gateway infrastructure of ports and airports, are very important. We have to remember that in international trade, 80% of the transportation of goods takes place by ships. And other physical infrastructure is also important. Particularly the quality and quantity of power supply. The land and labor policy and laws come next. They determine the competitiveness of manufacturing industry. Labor laws that make downsizing difficult are out of tune with the globalized world of manufacturing. As for land, what is needed is not merely easier land acquisition, but to deliver developed industrial plots to entrepreneurs, particularly MSMEs, so that they can plug and play, as they say.
Would you like to conclude?
Yes, last sentence.
About another 20 speakers after you.
In customs matters, we have a great deal of progress that we have made in paperless processing and single window clearance, but we are not yet beyond parity. We have not yet achieved parity with our competitors. I'll stop there.
Thank you. May I now invite Ashwini Mahajan? Ashwini ji?
Thank you, Pradeep ji. Thank you so much. What is the time allotted?
3 to 5 minutes.
You know, I have the extremist view. Anyways, first of all, let me very clearly say that the arguments which are made in favor of the free trade and WTO and other things, I fail to understand why we keep on saying that it was the WTO or the free trade which has led to the faster growth of Indian economy. If you look at the Indian economy, 3 sectors are there. The sector which has performed the best and the growth was highest was the service sector, which had nothing to do with the WTO and the lowering of the tariffs. So this is my first humble point. And the second point, which was made by Mr. Naushad, that we have missed something by dropping from the RCEP. Since I have been the staunch opponent of the RCEP, let me be very clear about it, that before embarking on any new agreements, we must understand what was the fate of the earlier agreements. And one of the speakers have already said that the experience with ASEAN and other like Japan and South Korea were not so good, and therefore, before embarking on any further agreements on say like RCEP, that was the reason. And why should we be just thinking about the industry? Naushad bhai, let me tell you that I have been talking to the different industries. I don't know from where the that survey has come. I have been talking to almost all the types of industries in chemical, automobile, electronics, telecom, everybody, and they had been complimenting me, appreciating our efforts, and congratulating and thanking the Swadeshi Jagat Manch for having stopped RCEP. Third point I want to make here is that so much of talk is going on about the FTAs, the proposed FTAs with EU and UK and Canada. Let me be very honestly and clearly telling you that the benefit which are being shown from these agreements, that we will get a better uh, market market share or market access. We must understand that already from WTO, we have already been allowed to have high bound tariff rates, and even our applied rates are uh, much higher than the applied rates of these countries. I don't want to burden you with the data because all of you know all that data, that the India is imposing ranging from 10% to 30% of the tariffs on different products, leaving is only exceptions are non-electrical machinery and the electrical machinery. Whereas Canada, EU and UK are imposing the tariffs between 0.9% to 11%. Therefore, the kind of benefit which are being showcased from the proposed FTAs is they are actually not realistic. The other point which I want to make here is that nobody is talking about the non-trade issues which are the part of these FTAs. One major non-trade issue is government procurement, and we know how important the government procurement is for the development of Indian industry. And I fully agree with my previous panelist who had said that industrial policy and the trade policy are both inseparable. We cannot talk about the trade policy without referring to our industrial policy. And we all know that we had been the victim of the free trade, so-called free trade, where China had been dominating our markets, and we had experienced a total deindustrialization of Indian economy over the last 20 years. And that is the very reason why the government has now embarked upon the policy of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is producing good results. And we have now started manufacturing many of the new products, and we are on the path of manufacturing even the semiconductors, which were never thought of. There is another, apart from the...
Would you like to conclude?
Yeah, I will conclude.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let me tell Pradeep, this is not good. Let me conclude. Let me conclude by saying that there are many other non-trade issues which must be taken into account. Intellectual property rights is one of them, because EU and UK, they are asking for amending our 3D in patent law, which is not acceptable. Trade and environment is yet another issue which must be looked into, because the future of the green industry comes from there. Electronic commerce and digital trade is yet another non-trade issue, and trade and gender is yet another non-trade issue which we must talk about. And just talking about a few commodities and only the industry, not thinking about the dairy, not thinking about the agriculture, is not going to be very prudent policy. Thank you.
Thank you. My apologies if I offended you, but you must understand that there are many speakers who are all wanting to
That's
speak.
fine, but you must. I started from this, that I have got the extremist view in the whole panel.
We would like to hear you. That is why we've invited you, and I'm so thankful that you came.
Thank you.
And I hope that you would also listen to others who may have a different view.
I have already listened. My response was after listening to them only, sir.
Oh, no, there are more. There are more.
Okay.
May I now come to Nagesh? Nagesh, 3 minutes, please. May I request all my friends that if they can restrict their remarks so that everybody gets an opportunity. And we have some excellent speakers in the crowd.
Yes.
3 former Commerce Ministry mandarins 4 or 5 of them. Mohan Kumar, Seshadri, Kem Chandrasekhar, Gopal Pillai, and I would like to hear all of them after you have spoken so that they can react to what the points you're making. But by the way, I must also share with the House that we have done a study for Department of Industries, or DIPP, or whatever you call it, on a convergence between trade policy and industrial policy. So we are on the same lines, except we would like to see to it that we do not end up into inverted duty structures and end up with kind of wrong tariff where we should be doing. And that is a point which Anwarul Huda also made. With that, now may I turn to Nagesh? 3 minutes, Nagesh.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Pradeep. I think it is the most interesting discussion. And I think one can make a lot of points on trade. But I want to just begin with a little bit of sense of realism. That
Nagesh, can I just interrupt because you made a very important point, and I would like to reiterate to the August eminent gathering here that we are interested in policy suggestions, not so. I mean, of course, you'd be required to refer to granularities in order to come to the policy suggestions, but policy suggestions is what we are looking at. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think the assertion that trade is good for growth and development and experiences of different countries are there to sort of prove or provide evidence for that. There was a time when world trade was growing by kind of 20% per year, and the years I am talking about is 2000 to 2008. In just 7 years or 8 years, it went, it increased by say 150%. And so in that period, if you were applying the, this emphasis on export-oriented industrialization and growth, it would be making very eminent sense. However, trade has never fully recovered from global financial crisis, and we know that the growth of trade, world trade, has been flat all these years. And 2021 was an aberration because growing from a 30% decline in 2020, so it looked very good. But we see in 22 again it is back to the similar kind of trend. Second point, that I think Professor Mahajan made this point about liberalization is a mixed blessing. And the contrast I always like is between Africa and East Asia. Africa had a 6% share of global exports in 1980. Today it is 3% or less. East Asia had 16% share of global exports in 1980. Today it has 30%. How did it happen? Is using very strategically industrial policy or strategic trade policy to build capacities, using or leveraging domestic market for building scales, and then being in the export markets with a lot of competitiveness. So we need to exploit our own own domestic market to become competitive, achieve scale economies, and then we can be competitive.
I think that is a point which was made by Suresh Prabhu, and I'm glad you're endorsing it. If I can move on, Nagesh?
Yeah. Then one more point, I think, which has been overlooked generally is the exchange rate management. It is a very important indicator or factor or determinant of competitiveness. We have always overlooked it and allowed rupee to appreciate in real terms. Unless we manage the rupee exchange rate, we will not become competitive. Nagesh,
can that be a trade policy prescription?
It could be, because trade policy, as Harsh said, it is an integration of all different, supportive policies.
I have also said
policy, exchange rate management.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nagesh. Let me move on. Uneasy lies the head which wears the crown.
Last point, I just want, because I am aware that a lot of speakers, one very important opportunity currently for India is China plus one de-risking strategy pursued by multinational companies. And we should make really, we should exploit that opportunity fully. For that, I think I tend to agree with Naushad. We need to be part of mega regional groupings. RCEP, we had concerns, we backed out, but IPF trade pillar, which may be shaping into a regional, mega regional grouping. I think we should be part of the negotiating team at least and decide later whether it serves our purpose or not. Be in the negotiating room and try to shape it in the manner that we would like.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, I hope you don't mind my cutting you off.
No,
Because, as I said,
I fully understand. Yeah.
Toral, over to you.
Thank you, Pradeep, for inviting me to such a prominent and high-level event. And I apologize for being late. I was in the funeral of a great friend, former development minister, deputy development minister. Now, I have a couple of points to make. First of all, I tend to agree with those pointing out the importance of industrial policy, also in conjunction with trade policy, not least. So here we take some issue with Martin Wolf. Maybe there's an element of ideological background here, I don't know. But anyway, I do support those in support of industrial policy and trade context. So my second point is back to Martin, where he points out that there's a major shift in the trade policy environment. And I tend to agree with that. Now, that shift is quite well displayed by the IPEF, the recent US Indo-Pacific initiative. Now, among the interesting newcomers in that trade context are, of course, the reference to environment and to labor issues. Now, that being said, my final point is a question. What was the reason for India not to agree to the trade chapter of the IPEF? Thank you.
Thank you, Tora. Alok? Put on your mic, please, Alok. Toral, can you mute yourself? Yeah. Tora, Alok, please put on your mic. Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I don't take much time. Very specific policy questions. Okay, number one, is our PLI scheme WTO compatible? Or at some point we may get into trouble? I don't know. This is one question. There are many experts who can perhaps answer this question better. Number two, we all agree that we need to plug into global value chains. But here there are lots of related issues, like at what point in this GVC? For example, if you remember in a very recent article in Economic Times, Swaminathan Iyer has questioned the wisdom of actually going in for or massively subsidizing the fabrication of, silicon fabrication in India. He prefers that
chips, you mean?
Yes, he prefers that we should perhaps import silicon from other countries and then go for chip manufacturing or assembling or whatever it is. I mean, at least to start with. So that is a very important policy question. Even if yes, we need to plug into global value chain, at what point should we to start with? Okay. And the third question is, okay, assuming that we need to join a trading bloc, if the answer is yes, then which one? Some kind of an ASEAN plus with China inside, or something like CPTPP led by China, led by Japan, China excluded. I mean, so that is again a very important policy question for us, given the geopolitical situation and all that. And finally, even if we agree that we need to protect some industries in India, maybe temporarily, but which is the preferred policy instrument? Is it the exchange rate protection, tariffs, or PLI? PLI is basically basically a production subsidy. Okay, and yeah, finally, the question is that US is also very much interested now in bringing back chip manufacturing to US, where it all started. Okay, because everyone wants to get away from China. Not everyone, but at least some countries. Now, and in this particular case, India also wants to do it. US wants to do it. And then we have other two major players here, was Taiwan, and the other one is South Korea. So fortunately for us, US, India, Taiwan, and South Korea are all opposed to China in some sense. Okay.
Okay.
So we can perhaps work out some kind of collaboration.
Alok, I mean, like you, many others are getting into trade strategy rather than trade policy. And what we are trying to see is that what are the kind of policy prescriptions which we should have in our policy instrument.
Okay.
I agree that strategy then would emanate from policy, and therefore you're describing it, but that is not a. Montek, over to you. Alok, please mute yourself. Yeah, thank you. Montek, please unmute. Yeah, thank you.
I think I've unmuted.
Yes,
How many minutes do you want me to speak for?
How many minutes do you want?
No, that's unfair. Actually,
there are too many
I would
people.
Happily have conceded.
Yeah, I mean, you are as much as a co-host. So I mean, you can be liberal and
let me be very brief.
Take 90 seconds.
First point. I think we need to, in order to find out where are we agreeing and where are we not agreeing.
Right.
I think we need some filters to be used. I mean, for example, Suresh, I don't think Suresh is with us now. He's gone off to do some important things. Yeah. But, he started off by saying that he had set up the Surjit Bhalla committee, which did get a lot of coverage. But he didn't point out, and he gave that as an example of how his ministry was doing the right thing to evolve a strategy. The most important thing about the Surjit Bhalla committee was it said we should join RCEP. The fact of the matter is not what the government did. So we always set up committees, and that's good, but we don't necessarily listen to what committees say, and that's a separate issue. So let me make let me make just 6 points, and I won't argue them, but I just want to put them on the table. And maybe at some later point, I can even send out a written submission to you. Point number 1, let's separate the no-brainers on which there's really we need infrastructure, we need logistics. Nobody disagrees with that. So I think that's one. We can't have a decent trade policy if we have lousy infrastructure and lousy logistics. We can't have decent industrialization with that either. So that's a no-brainer. Second, I think Anwar made a very important point, and I want to completely agree with him. You have to have a view on tariffs, okay? I agree with what Anwar said. The view should be that we should have modest tariffs, an average level, not very different from, let's say, other developing countries in the region. And we should especially try, in going towards the average, to narrow the dispersion. And within narrowing the dispersion, we must absolutely take care of these tariff inversions. Now, you should put that across to people. Do they agree? The important point is we must lower the tariff. So, I mean, if they don't agree with that, then just say that they don't agree. That's second point. Third, and this has been made by Nagesh, you can't talk about tariffs without a parallel view on the exchange rate. All these people who want higher tariffs have got a hell of a lot of benefit from the exchange rate having depreciated, at least vis-a-vis the dollar, in recent months or weeks. And the fact of the matter is that your tariff policy should be supported by an exchange rate policy. Now remember, neither tariffs nor exchange rate will come in the foreign trade policy, because the foreign trade policy is about what the Commerce Ministry does. And yet I would argue that these are the two most important single things that one can think of. So somewhere, somehow, that has to be fed in. The third issue is really, what's your view on free trade? I mean, free trade areas. I agree with what Anwar and many others, Martin and all have said. Traditionally, we have argued that multilateral trade liberalization is the best way to go. But the honest truth is we never conducted ourselves in a manner in which multilateral trade negotiation would be encouraged, because our position on that was always, you liberalize, we are developing countries, we don't have to liberalize. And therefore, we created a situation where our major trading partners simply came to the conclusion that multilateral trade negotiations will get them nowhere. And there's no hope really of anything in that front. The world has got fragmented into different free trade areas, and you have to ask yourself, do you want to join them? My view is, yes, we should. It's the only damn thing we can do. And the logical thing would be to integrate in the areas where we are talking about economies near us who are roughly similar. Now, I have no problem with extending it into Africa and so on. I mean, if there is interest in those countries, but let's be clear, there are some free trade agreements that are neither here nor there. I mean, the UAE free trade agreement is only there in order to tick a box. The UAE has very, very low tariffs on everything in any case. So exactly what is the point of a free trade? And secondly, they don't produce, except for petrol, crude oil, they don't produce it, but they sort of trade in it. I mean, there is really very little trade advantage that we are going to get between the UAE and India. I'm glad that we are doing a free trade agreement because it kind of creates a little momentum. But the important free trade agreements really were Australia, EU, UK. If you talk to the Australians, they're deeply disappointed in the extremely narrow and limited range of opening that we've done. They've accepted it by saying, okay, early harvest, etc. But talk to them privately and they'll tell you this really reflects a position where you don't want free trade, but you want a free trade agreement. EU, extremely important. I have no idea how much progress is being made. And of course, on UK, you've seen in the newspapers that both sides are now saying that the so-called Diwali deadline is not really a deadline at all. So, I mean, I would say that the arguments against RCEP should have been better debated. If we are worried about China, the correct thing to do would be to join the CPTT, which is the thing which the US walked out of, but Japan is front rolling. And that doesn't have China, and it's unlikely to have China. That raises a related question. Joining a free trade area is not just about giving tariff concessions. These guys are now much more interested in deeper behind the border integration. Now, I think our negotiators have traditionally taken the view that this is an intrusion in our sovereignty and that we have no business demanding these things. That may be true in the sense that it's not what traditionally trade agreements were, but we're no longer talking just about trade agreements, you're talking about integration. And frankly, I mean, to say that they're going to bring in IPR, we should bring in IPR. What's wrong with bringing in IPR? Let's have an agreement on what's a sensible IPR. They will bring in environment. What's wrong with that? I mean, we are the worst sufferers from having neglected the environment, so we should be doing something about that too. So I feel that these arguments that are put forward in order to negate entry into these agreements are really bad, and submitting some discipline, submitting ourselves to some plurilateral discipline would be good for us. I mean, that, by the way, is what the Chinese did when they joined WTO. I mean, internally, they knew it was putting some discipline on them, but they argued that this discipline is a good thing, and that's what we should be doing. And finally, this is my last point, GVAs. The government has said we want GVAs. That's wonderful. I think that we should. But somehow the thinking seems to be that our concept of GVA is integrate backwards and sort of have a wholly integrated chain in which we will produce the final product. That's not what a GVA is about. A GVA is about pitching in to that part of the production process where you have a competitive advantage. And let me say that in this new technology area, we have a competitive advantage in, for example, chip design. I've seen some data somewhere that 20% of all the engineers involved in chip design are based in India. They're mostly employed by foreign firms doing chip designing for them. So we are a part of that global value chain. So I think that, let's see what happens with this chip manufacture. I mean, one of the interesting things, by the way, is that we seem to have loosened the requirement in terms of nanometers to become eligible for the subsidy. I mean, originally, for the higher percentage of subsidy, you had to be at the low nanometer range. Now, irrespective of where you are, you get the same subsidy. And there is an issue that is this subsidy being properly budgeted? I mean, if Foxconn Vedanta is going to cost whatever, $20 billion, have we budgeted? I'm not aware, by the way, what it means. 50% of capital. Does it mean that we are promising a $10 billion subsidy? What are the procedures on the basis of which this subsidy will be disbursed? Will it be disbursed for eligible expenditures which produce the right kind of end product, or simply expenditures? And frankly, I feel that I'd like to know more about the details and the terms, but we don't have that yet. Technically, I don't think that's been approved. So what we've got is an announcement and a general sort of feeling that this is a good thing, but let's see what happens. You have to keep in mind, by the way, that there is a budget constraint. We can spend $10 billion on one company, or we could spend $10 billion in massively upgrading infrastructure and railways. All these infrastructure bases that we've been talking about for export competitive areas. So I think there are too many loose ends that need to be put together. But I think that's about all I have to say. I may have more to say after other people have commented. But thank you for organizing this and inviting me. Thank you.
No, excellent. And I'm glad that you decided to speak in between and responded to some of these comments, which really helps to enrich the debate, as it were. And not the Vedant investment in Foxconn in Gujarat also involves huge amount of state subsidies, which is sort of liability of the Gujarat government, which have been promised to them. So I'm not getting into that, but just to point out to you that there is not only central subsidy, but state subsidies also. Having said that, may I request Veena Jha? Veena, over to you. As brisk, as sharp, as succinct as you can be.
Okay.
Now, may I just interrupt you? Can I request the eminent gathering if we can go up to 8 o'clock? We have no problem.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, because I see there are a lot of people who should speak. Not only that they're not, so that we are able to get a better debate. So 8 o'clock is fine. Over to you, Veena.
Okay. Thank you, Pradeep, and I'll respond. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll respond to some of the comments that have been made and also put in my own suggestions for the FTP. The first thing that I'd like to respond to is Naushad's comments on FTAs, and that also incorporates Martin's comments. FTA is by far the second best in all situations, but nevertheless, this is the only method in which we can expand our trade at this point of time when WTO has come to a kind of a hiatus where further liberalization is not taking place. And also in FTA, we have to be very careful not only to look at the products that we are negotiating, but also services and investment. What are the conditions in the FTAs on services and investment? Because often we can compensate for a loss in products if we have because we have an advantage in terms of services and investment. On the comment of Martin and many others, I'd like to just reflect very briefly on the PLI scheme, the production linked incentive scheme. Number one, we believe it is compatible with the WTO. Number two, PLI does not require government outlays because there are two conditions which are essential for it. Number one, investment must increase and output must increase. And it is based on the output and investment increase. And it has a sunset clause because it's only for 4 years. And the way it was implemented is GST was increased from 12 to 18%. This is only for the electronic sector, from 12 to 18%, and then a 4 to 5% PLI was given. So in my view, it's revenue neutral for the government. And though it was extended to many sectors, and this was done in 2020, so far only the electronic sector has managed to actually garner the PLI, because it has both grown and investments have grown and exports have grown. That's as far as these two comments are concerned. My views on the FTP are, first of all, there should be an integration of trade and investment policy in the FTP, because trade and investment policy have to go hand in hand, and there has to be coherence. In India, we have some examples of where there is no coherence between the two. For example, while we encouraged investment in electronics, we are also put tariffs on inputs. So we had at the same time two inconsistent policies, and this is something to be avoided in a proper framework of an FTP. The second issue is that we have to address the point on NTMs. And by NTMs, I don't only mean the trade remedy measures, but I also mean there are many other issues which are coming under NTMs today, and these need to be addressed. I mean, things like localization, things like, interest rate subsidy, many issues which are coming in, which need to be addressed. So that is my second. And the third point is that where domestic policy comes in the way of increasing exports, we have to address that in the FTP. And there are specific instances where domestic policy in India has actually been export restrictive. And those are the issues that we have to address. So I'll stop there. And I hope that was brief enough, Pradeep.
Thank you very much. Sometimes in these kind of structured manner, one has to be a little tight as well as much as possible. And as I said, it sort of uneasy lies the head which wears the crown. If I have to butt into, dear friends, I'm sorry, my apologies in advance. Over to you, Arne. Arne.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a number of topics. So I would say that for India, first, India needs this trade agreement with itself, domestic integration as a platform for global integration. So in that respect, India has made leaps forward, so that's great. And a very important integration across regions, infrastructures, etc. Second is the domestic trade policy of India, the level of tariffs. Countries don't get rich by high tariffs, so it's a timely debate on the level and sectoral design of tariffs. So the third level is the multilateral scene. And as coming from a small country, we are kind of disproportionately occupied with the need for multilateral regulations in the field of trade, especially in a time with weaker growth in many countries and polarization and tensions between some important countries. So I'd like to flag the need to preserve WTO as a tool for global cooperation and conflict resolution in the field. I think in general, WTO is a great success in the field of manufacturing, trade, and tariffs. It's a mixed success in the field of services. It has a kind of basic framework for regulations, but it cannot set the standards. And my view is that the free trade agreements sometimes it's just a handful of free trade agreements that really set the standards, like the Western European integration, maybe Australia, New Zealand, etc., that are really deep, go beyond WTO on SPS, TBT, and other areas. So there is no quick fix in terms of regulations for chemicals, for pharmaceuticals, for ICT, data traffic, etc. So you have to work on different levels, multilateral, not only the WTO, but also in free trade agreements and sectoral agreements. So I think India should play a role in all these scenes, also the multilateral scenes, and try to be a constructive player when the USA has kind of abdicated as a leader in the WTO, as it has been for several decades. So I also think that the concept of SDT, special and differential treatment, was kind of conceived in the 1960s and 1970s, where the world was very different. So I think this needs a kind of rehaul and new analytical work to provide an underpinning for SDT. So if the best thing about free trade is to be exempted, it is not right in the situation, in the new kind of world economy. So yeah, so my request is that India also plays an important constructive role in the multilateral trade system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Some people want to leave at 7:30. So if you don't mind, can I request them to speak before others do? Deepak Mishra. Deepak, over to you as swiftly as possible. You've got 3 minutes left at 7:30 if you have to leave sharp at 7:30. Deepak? Deepak? Hello? Sorry, he seems to have gone. So may I request Mark? Mark, over to you. Mark Linscott.
Yeah, thanks, Pradeep. And let me just note that I'm very humbled as a U.S. observer and really an expert on U.S. trade policy, although with a huge interest in India trade policy. First, quickly, FTAs do matter. I mean, some are more important than others, but they do matter. I grew up a youngster in trade in a much more MFN world. Many of us at that time thought FTAs were a necessary evil. They were an exception to MFN. The genie's out of the bottle now. Everybody's been doing FTAs for several decades. And those who do not do FTAs lose out because trade is much more preferential, at least in terms of tariffs, than it used to be. And I certainly think that the US administration, the Biden administration, has a weak trade policy precisely because of this. It's tied a hand behind its back. IPEF is not the equivalent of CPTPP or any other FTAs we might do. Secondly, FTAs do require hard choices, as many have noted. It's not just about exporting, it's about importing as well. It's being willing to open the market to trade from that FTA partner, and that can be politically sensitive. And certainly with respect to the U.S., assuming that we ever get back to the table to do FTAs, and ideally to do one with India, it will involve a lot of these issues that are non-tariff. For the United States, labor and environment and government procurement, those are trade issues. They're not non-trade issues. And we've been negotiating on those issues in FTAs for years. CPTPP is an example of that. And thirdly, on industrial policy and trade policy, they are inseparable. I do think that the more protectionist an industrial policy, the worse it is to have an effective trade policy and to negotiate with trading partners. Whether it's, for example, the United States, the Biden administration, the Trump administration before it has gone much more protectionist in its industrial policies. With tariffs on China, 232 on steel and aluminum, government procurement, in terms of Buy America, the Inflation Reduction Act that has domestic content requirements associated with electric vehicles. That's not necessarily good for our trade policy. So, it's all relative in terms of industrial policy and trade policy. So again, thank you for letting me be part of this group.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you also to be very precise. May I invite Razak, please?
Thank
Razak,
you.
3 minutes.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Pradeep, for this opportunity. I'm going to make 3 quick points. The first one is, in one of the interventions we heard, the relationship between, say, trade GDP ratio and the need for having more growth. The problem currently is this: because of the value chain led trade, we are seeing much less value is being added. And that is why the problem is, if we are going to measure just trade as percent of GDP, that might not generate enough growth. One concrete example before you: Bangladesh and Vietnam. In 1990, both countries exported around $1.5 billion worth of exports. Now Vietnam exports $350 billion plus, Bangladesh $52 billion. So you can see the difference. But if we would compare the average growth of Vietnam over the past 30 years, that is slightly lower than Bangladesh. You see, so Bangladesh took a completely different kind of strategic planning. But then the problem is, some of you might argue that maybe because of that inward-oriented policies, there could be other costs. But until now, we haven't seen that one. So even for India, the more emphasis we have on trade GDP ratio, I think that may not translate into hard economic growth, given the nature of the trade that we are seeing. So that's number one. Number two is, I think, on the policy side, we also need to holistically think for a developing country like India, and also countries like Bangladesh and South Asia, that we really want to link trade with growth or also other policy aspects. And here is again one issue. In the case of Bangladesh, between 2010 and say now, in the last 20 years, our exports have grown from say $12 billion to currently $50 billion. But if you would ask, how much employment has been generated in the export industry, especially in the ready-made garment industry, basically not a single additional employment the industry has been able to generate. So that's the extent of automation we are talking about. So at some point in time, with trade policy, the industrial upgradation and employment policies, those will also have to be kind of linked up. Otherwise, overemphasis cannot help growth prospect. And here the other problem is the exporters or traders. They can do well, and then in some countries it is so difficult to tax them. Then in a way, the net benefit for trade from many of the developing countries becomes questionable, and that is the dilemma that we are seeing in a country like Bangladesh. Now that brings me to the next point. With any trade agreements, trade policy options, there are going to be winners and losers. That is more inevitable kind of thing. Now, Pradeep, you mentioned about the flanking policies, but I think one of the issues that we also need to consider is the kind of policies that would be needed to compensate for the people who are going to lose out of the from the trade issues. And here are concrete examples.
I mentioned that in my opening remarks.
Yes, you did. And I would just like to highlight the problem is, see, before the 2016 US election and also the Brexit related debate and the issues, the political upheavals that we have seen in the West, at that time, you would recall that the unemployment rate in Europe and America was pretty low. I mean, but even then, there are a lot of discontent against globalization because the politicians and the policymakers, they failed to tackle the problem of inequality. Now, again, the same kind of problem can arise if we are unable to deal with inequality. So, Pradeep, I think we must link the policies, trade policy fine, but also how we are going to compensate the people who are going to lose out. It's a very important issue. My final point will be, Pradeep, and I think someone has already mentioned that point, but I would like to elaborate. For a country like India, can you really think that India shouldn't have any role in multilateral sphere? I think India is time to take lead on the multilateral issues. The multilateral trade is kind of under WTO is currently stalled. But if you would look at the statistic that the WTO produced, I think several years back, all trade that takes place, even consider the trade that takes place under FTA, then 84% of that trade takes place not because of preferential agreements, because of non-preferential terms and conditions that they have. So that is why, unless we're going to have settled multilateral norms, dispute settlement mechanism, then even a country like India is going to be affected. So I believe it is now high time, given the political tension that we're seeing between US and China, I think for India to high time to think about how the multilateral rules are going to be made strengthened. And as a result of that, some of the developing countries, they can get more kind of a certain environment. And we should then all be able to benefit from that process. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Razak. Let me begin by disabusing you that India is a very strong believer in multilateralism. And that is one of the reasons we showed up in MC12 as well. And I won't get into the murky details there, but I'll speak to you about it on a one-to-one basis. Having said that, let me now turn to Mohan Kumar, Sheshadri, Gopal Pillai in that order. And we have about 20, we have about 33 minutes.
Thank you, Pradeep. I'll take no more than 2 minutes. I wanted to congratulate you for your initiative. I hope you will make a record of the events and send it to us. I think it'll be an extremely useful basic material from which policymakers can draw. I just wanted to say from a different perspective that the fact that we are not a 5 trillion economy today is hurting us terribly in foreign and security policy. I think we could have approached the climate change issue differently. We could have approached even the Ukraine issue differently if we were a 5 trillion economy. I cannot overemphasize what Shri Suresh Prabhu said, which is it's not about becoming 5 trillion or 10 trillion. The question is, how soon can we get there? There is no point in telling me we will become a 10 trillion economy by the year of the Lord 2040. That simply does not help me, which is why I have always felt trade is too important an issue to be just left to trade experts. It impinges in a way that many people here may not imagine on the foreign and security policy. Secondly, I thought our approach was clear because the former Commerce Secretary elucidated it in some detail by saying that we will talk about non-trade issues in bilateral agreements like labor, environmental standards, and others, because we are not comfortable doing that in the WTO yet. That is what the Commerce Secretary said on record. He has written.
Subramaniam.
Exactly.
Yeah, so, because we have other former Commerce Secretaries here also.
Yeah, yes. So I think the approach is clear is what I'm saying. 40 to 50% of our GDP is FTA or at least, foreign trade. So I think we have no choice, really. I was just in Lisbon. I'll take 1 more minute. Last week, I was talking to the chief negotiator of the EU FTA. We had only people from the Indian embassy in Brussels. My basic take is that it is going, but there are serious issues that have to be resolved. My concern is that sooner or later, political will be on display. We will have to get the Prime Minister's office and others to get involved because, as someone said, I think it might have been Mr. Montek Ahluwalia, the EU FTA is probably the most important, frankly. And I think we should get it done. Last but not least, Pradeep, the point is trade agreements have failed in the past, FTA relatively, not because they were bad agreements and were badly negotiated. It's because we haven't been able to put reforms in place. That's the reason. I mean, we did textiles and garments in the WTO. Who benefited? Vietnam, Bangladesh benefited more than India. But is that really Vietnam's fault? I don't think so. I think India could have benefited much more from the textiles and garments agreement. So really, the FTAs, the trade policy has to be seen in conjunction with reforms. If you think I'm right, and I'm going to be provocative, if we reform only by compulsion and not by conviction, then I think if you are smart, you will use the FTAs to put in place reforms as well. And that's the way to go forward. I'll stop here because there have been some excellent.
Thank you. But before I turn to others, Ashwini Mahajan has raised a question to Montek. Montek, are you there? Montek, Ashwini Mahajan has raised a question to you, and you had a question to Veena Jha. If you can do it in about 90 seconds or 120 seconds, it will be great. Montek, please unmute yourself. Montek. please unmute yourself. Montek, please unmute yourself. We can't hear you. Montek, please unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Well, as regards.
Have you seen Ashwini Mahajan's question to you?
Yes, I've seen that, and I completely agree with him. These are not issues that should be snuck through in some closed door meeting. These are issues that we should go public with our own public, and have a public debate on them. I mean, for example, Mohan Kumar talked about why it is that we haven't reformed. And that is a valid point. We haven't reformed, and we haven't reformed particularly in textiles. We just didn't do the labor reforms that were needed. I mean, if it's not good enough to introduce flexibility, taking the present 100 employees limit back to 300. You know, it was 300 in 1981. Mrs. Indira Gandhi lowered it to 100 because she did some little liberalization, and her left advisors said that we must balance this off by doing something for labor. And what they did for labor is actually prevent an expansion in employment in the textile industry later on. So I think we need these things to be publicly debated. And I totally agree with him that sneaking them in as some kind of trade consequence is completely wrong. As far as Veena's point is concerned, I agree with her that the PLI is WTO compliant because it's not a subsidy on export. But she did say that, you know, the subsidy will come when production happens, and if production is expanding, obviously there'll be also revenue growth. That doesn't apply to the semiconductor subsidy. I don't know whether the semiconductor subsidy is treated as part of PLI or not. But from what I've read in the newspaper, and that you were also saying, that both the center and the state are going to give a capital subsidy. Now, a capital subsidy is not something that happens after production takes place. I have a further point here that, you know, I don't mind at all an industrial policy, which, as she rightly pointed out, that this is time bound. I mean, it disappears after, in the case of the production linked incentive, it disappears after 4 years. But it should be combined with a clear policy on tariffs. We should not have a situation where industries are set up, and as the subsidies withdrawn, they start lobbying for higher tariffs. That is why I think we need an overarching tariff policy which will not be departed from. Anyway, thank you for
Thank you,
letting me answer these
but
questions.
please stay because there are some very interesting speakers still left. May I request?
Can I respond? Can I respond, Pradeep?
You know, time come ekdam. You can come back to him. You can respond to chat box.
Yeah, will do.
Yeah. May I request Gopal Pillai? Gopal?
Yeah.
Gopal, where are you? You're using some Sanjeet's computer.
Pradeep,
Are you there?
it's Tura, very briefly, while we wait. Is that okay?
No, Tunal, hold on. I have not called you. Please hold on. Gopal? Oh, God, he's gone. Yeah, Tunal, if you wanted to make a 30-second intervention.
Thank you, Pradeep. I just want to take this opportunity, since I meet my old friend, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, just spoke. We spent some heavy battles at the WTO about 20 years ago plus. And I do remember one discussion we had on trade and services moved forward, where Mohan and I had a little bit of a different perspective of things. I guess he was one of the architects behind the services agreement, including move forward, perhaps in particular. Now, one to me that, well, temporary movement of natural persons is precisely temporary. My reply was that, well, for the individual, it might be temporary, or it does happen.
Thank you. You exceeded 30 seconds.
Yeah, my point is the impact of mode 4 is not temporary, neither at home nor abroad. Thank you.
Tariffs and input should not be increased.
Thank you. May I request Sheshadri?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mehta. 4 broad points. I would argue.
We've got only 15 minutes left.
I would argue for building a strong indigenous domestic industry in strategic areas. But the ecosystem
this has already been said by many people.
But the ecosystem that is needed for that is somewhat different from the ecosystem that is needed for global supply chain promotion. Particularly at the level of competitiveness of a country like India. Now, the challenge before trade policy makers is how to best harmonize the two in terms of tariff policies. Mr. Hoda has made some useful suggestions. Subsidy policies, standards and compliance policy, and enforcement and regulatory policy. Second point, FTAs, we need FTAs. And I think the government is going in the right direction, but we need a strategy. But I see a lot of comments being made by people, even as the negotiations are proceeding. Please do not mistake tactics for strategy. Government is negotiating investment.
Can you please mute your mic?
Pardon?
Please mute your mic, Harsh. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah. So please do not mistake tactic for strategy. Very rightly, government is approaching easier FTAs first, like Australia, UAE, and UK, before it comes to EU, which will be more difficult. But that does not mean that we are shying away from environment or labor or other issues. It will be easier for us to tackle them if we did these FTAs first. Number 3 point, I would fully agree with Naushad Forbes. Please give US some special attention. Particularly because it is the single largest export partner. It is one of the very few countries with we have a trade surplus, both on the goods and the services front. There are issues to be resolved for the Trade Policy Forum. I think we should have it done quickly, and we should also seek GSP restoration as well as revocation of the steel and aluminum duties, and perhaps on the totalization agreement. Last point. There are 4 important negotiations that will take place during the next 2 years. One is the WTO reform. 2, FTA negotiations that we are currently undertaking. 3, building up of IPF, where I think we have temporarily stayed out of trade pillar. Again, I think as a tactic, not as a final position. So we should be careful not to mistake one for the other. And finally, our own evolving domestic policy in terms of how to tweak FTI, etc. These are all something that has to be seen together. Hopefully, the trade policy that the government will come out with will fuse all these aspects together and take them into account. That is very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I request Preetam Banerjee?
Thank you very much for giving me the time.
I'll come to you, Sangeeta, after this.
Just very quick, I agree very strongly with this connection that between investment and trade, and there on the PLI, the big point that we are missing out is that there's market seeking and efficiency seeking investments, FDI, and you cannot have value chain integration without MNCs coming in big numbers. But PLI and the tariff protection actually go hand in hand for a market seeking FDI. Basically strategy is raise tariffs on certain products and offer PLI in that, forcing people to relocate to India, both for that reason. Now the question is it sustainable in the long run? How do you transit from being a market-seeking kind of policies to a efficiency-seeking kind of policy? So once they have come in, how do you keep these factories here, because they're extremely mobile? So if the tariff protection goes away, the incentives go away, what do you have to keep them here? The problem there is that when it comes to manufacturing specifically, there is a lot of bad perception around India. I think that's the one thing people are not talking about. The perception about doing business over here is bad, and the bad news spreads very fast. People in the Asia Pacific headquarters in Singapore, Hong Kong, they talk to each other. And one bad incident of some approvals not getting done, etc., it spreads, and that perception is very hard to beat. The reality might be completely different. And that's the thing we need to address. And we are not addressing that in a substantive manner today. Because what we have discussed before, Pradeep ji, is the plumbing matters. And the plumbing is with the state governments. The plumbing is with the state, it's not the central government, it's with the state governments. And that's also the reason why we have such an unequal industrialization in India itself. One thing we are not discussing is that if we want trade and industrialization to reduce poverty, to reduce inequality in our country, then we have to also change the industrial geography map of this country. It's concentrated now in a handful of states. And the reason for that, again, is this plumbing, where some states have got it right, other states don't. So this tango of trade policy, investment policy, and industrial policy, which encompasses not just these kind of incentive schemes, but as Harshaji correctly pointed out, a number of areas, including substantive doing business, is the key. I'll end there. Thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you very much. Sangeeta, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pradeep, and thank you for inviting me. And this has been a very interesting discussion. I think one point I would like to highlight here is that we have not been talking about MSMEs. Because they are the backbone of the economy, they are the ones, this is just one point I'll make. This is a sector that must actually benefit from any free trade agreement, whether we do it with the UK or whether with the EU or Australia, whichever it be, because they contribute, if we look at it, they contribute nearly 40% of international trade within India. So I think government has to start thinking about coming up with an enabling policy for MSMEs. And we've been talking about PLI and other schemes, but I think a definitive enabling environment has to be created, which will allow MSMEs to increase their contribution to GDP, which currently is at 29%, to increase that and also make them important players in achieving export targets. I'll stop here. I know time is short.
Thank you. Thank you. That was Sangeeta Khurana, who's a British expert, trade expert, and working with the British ministry also to see as to how they can, after Brexit, how they can improve their own trade policy. Having said that, for the last comment to Abhishek Kumar, unfortunately, we've lost some of our very serious speakers like Gopal Pillai or K.M. Chandrasekhar, etc., who had hoped that they would have stayed on, but I suppose they had other commitments. Having said that, Abhishek, 2 to 3 minutes to you, and then over to Vipul for the final vote of thanks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mehta. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mehta.
Sorry to be, very.
No, I'll be very pithy because I've already written my comments in the chat box.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you'll be sharing that. But very, very quickly, just want to highlight one thing that, in considered opinion, states are at the heart of trade. But what we are seeing currently is that we seem to have a very broken fiscal federal structure, and most of the states seem to be slipping in fiscal distress, which affects our ability to trade. I mean, just to give you an example, recent RBI reports suggest that 10 states which contribute to half of India's expenditure and revenues are in a highly fiscally vulnerable state. So my suggestion is that fiscal federalism, especially in the current scenario, should be seen as a prerequisite to healthy trade policy and also to healthy fiscal relations between states and center. That's about it.
Thank you. What comes out to me personally from this very rich discussion is that we require a more integrated economic policy to deal with trade and not just leave it to Commerce Ministry. Commerce Ministry could be the executioner for such elements of trade policy which deals with tariffs, etc., etc. But the fact is that either it is some kind Niti Aayog, for example. We were likely to have a Niti Aayog representative here. He had to be called off. But we do need a very serious approach to not only define the policy, but to see that what is the point of having a policy if you do not have a good machinery to implement it. That is coming out quite evidently, and we are not talking to each other. In any case, as we know, even in the same Ministry of Commerce and Industry, don't talk to each other. We did a study, you'll be surprised, but the responses that we got from one ministry to the other ministry was, no, how can we say that? How can we criticize them? Of course you can criticize them. If you don't criticize them, how do you think things can move forward? So there are a lot of things that we still need to think about, but my personal takeaway is that we require a more holistic economic policy which deals with trade in the context of industrial policy, competition policy. As I said, Sangeeta, I mentioned SMEs also to begin with in my opening remarks if you had not missed it. SMEs are the backbone of the Indian economy today.
Exactly.
They employ more, they export more than the large and medium industry, etc., etc. But they're sort of fragmented, etc. That you need to. It's like our agriculture suffered because of very wide fragmented land holdings. But anyway, I'm coming back to that. Now we've just got 2 minutes left. Over to you, Bipul.
Thank you. Before I say formal thanks to all of you, I'd like to highlight 3 points very briefly, very quickly. First is that I don't think there is any contradiction between trade policy and industrial policy, and that has come very evidently in today's discussion. One has to be consistent with each other. Secondly is, I think...
And competition policy.
Yeah, of course, there are a host of other policies.
No.
Competition is one of the major ones, of course. Secondly, I think we are making too much of interventions in our foreign exchange market. I'm not at all saying that we shouldn't make any intervention, but there should be more balance in that. Let our rupee depreciate a little bit more as against US dollars, so that our exporters particularly, they can also gain a lot as a result of that, particularly when our fiscal space is very much constrained and there is a limit to what monetary policy can do. And third and final point is the one which Dr. Singh has made. Is more important, other than just having a consistent, balanced trade policy, balanced with other policies and consistent with other policies as well, including employment growth, etc. I think we need to have more thinking, emphasis on the implementation of our trade policy. And let me recall in this case, a related point which Dr. Singh has made, not in today's webinar, but earlier in one of our webinars, that in India, I guess in many other countries, if not all, that the trade policy, while it is being made by our Commerce Department, DGFT, its implementation is done by various other ministries, including revenue and many others. So that coordination also becomes a challenge. So how are we going to overcome that? I think we need to put more thinking into that.
Bipul, just one very important remark which Preetam made, that we are forgetting our states.
Yes, of course. I mean, no, I'm not here.
That is where all the work lies.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that, let me thank all of you once again, and we're going to summarize it. We're going to come out with a policy paper and take it forward at various levels, particularly DGFT. And we hope that when the new trade policy comes in April next year, usually they're in 2 parts. Part A is the thinking part, part B is the details. So all these thoughts will be reflected in the trade policy which is going to come, and it will be implemented better as compared to what it was in the past. Thank you. And good evening. Good
Let
night.
me personally thank all of you for having come here and participated in this virtual meeting, which of course has now become much more easier to talk about many things, especially if you know each other well. Having said that, and my apologies once again for having cut short people, because even now, as I said, we still have a lot of good speakers who could not speak and have left because probably because we had planned till 7:30. But next time we'll plan for some longer event. Having said that, as Bipul said, we'll be producing proceedings of this particular event, and you can always comment on that for a final version. Thank you very much.